For decades, the Queen Mary has lived under a haunted reputation that's grown bigger than the ship herself. Some people believe that over 600 spirits supposedly roam her decks, from children who never stopped playing to sailors who never clocked out, and shadows that appear to replay a moment in time exactly where people died, or where people say they died. Some stories come from crew members who swore they saw something, others come from hotel guests who ran screaming in the middle of the night, and a few, well, let's just say that no one can even agree where they started. But what is going on with the Queen Mary? Is she truly one of the most haunted locations in the world? Or is she more haunted by her own legends? So last week we chatted all about the Queen Mary's history, from her construction in Scotland through to her time as an ocean liner, her job and the accident during World War II, all of it, including where she is right now in Long Beach, California as a floating hotel and visitor attraction. And I mean, ghosts or not, I just want to go and see her for the history, but that's the thing. The ghosts are a massive part of the Queen Mary's story right now. You've got paranormal investigations, ghost tours, TV shows and YouTubers filming there, even scare attractions. You've got a lot going on. And if the stories are to be believed, with good reason, really. Peter James, the paranormal investigator and psychic who spent hours and hours on the ship, said that there were as many as 600 ghosts haunting the Queen Mary, with one staff member claiming that the company loses 10 employees per year because of the paranormal activity. They experienced something so terrifying on board, they just straight up quit their jobs on the spot. I wonder if it happens that often. Does HR have a little checklist in the exit interview? Just let us know which ghost upset you so HR can have a little word. So before we get into this, it does bear repeating from part 1 that a lot of people find it a little strange that talk of ghosts on the Queen Mary didn't really start until after 1988, when the Walt Disney Company took over operations and started offering ghost tours. So do with that information what you will. But that's all I'll say for now, because I have so many ghosts to tell you about, and it seems only right to start with what seems to be one of the most famous ones, Little Jackie. So while the first class swimming pool has been closed to visitors for a few years now because of safety concerns, that room is said to be where the ghost of a little girl called Jackie is commonly spotted. She's described as a playful entity and enjoys playing hide and seek and actually having full conversations with visitors. Interestingly though, Jackie has supposedly also been seen outside of the confines of the ocean liner, something that no other ghost in this place has apparently done. Because in the late 80s, after Jack Rather had saved the aircraft known as the Spruce Goose and got it set up in the giant dome next to the ship, there was a security guard doing his rounds one night and locking up after a day of visitors. And this security guard looked over at the Spruce Goose and he was absolutely horrified to see a young girl, happy as anything, walking along one of the wings of the plane. You absolutely cannot be up there, kid. And so he shouted at her to very carefully get down. That is so dangerous. This little girl looked at him, smiled, and said, as kids do, "Okay," before jumping off the wing of the plane. Now feels as good a time as any to tell you that the height of the Spruce Goose from the floor to the top of the vertical tail fin is just over 79 feet. So even just being on the wing, this little girl would have been a good distance in the air. The security guard could do nothing but watch in horror as this child fell, but before she reached the ground, she completely disappeared. But that encounter, with its kind of playful, innocent nature, is thought to have been Jackie. I'm sure the security guard did not see it as a fun, playful experience. But the story behind Jackie is where it gets a little eyebrow-raising, shall we say, because people say that her full name was Jackie Torrin, and she was a passenger who unfortunately drowned in the pool after 1947 but before the 1950s. And not even the first class pool where her ghost has now been seen, but the second class one, the one that doesn't actually exist anymore. It was one of the casualties of the hotel conversion in 1970. However, there is a slight problem with this story in that there's no record of any child drowning in any pool at any time, let alone a little girl called Jackie in the second class pool. And that's not to say that an accident didn't happen on board. As we saw in part 1, the ship's first captain, Sir Edgar Britton, he suffered his fatal stroke on the Queen Mary, but he didn't pass away until he was in the nursing home in Southampton a couple of hours later. Possibly another theory could be that, yeah, Jackie didn't die on the ship, but perhaps she was a passenger at some point and has just returned here after death as it was a place that she loved in life. Who knows? But this first class pool itself is said to be a pretty active area anyway. And while the pool got drained a long time ago after decades of salt water and heat had warped the tank and messed up the steel under the tiles, on multiple occasions people have sworn that they've heard what sounds like people playing and splashing about in the water, just enjoying a nice afternoon. But obviously the pool is completely empty. And this was actually taken one step further, literally, as you're about to see, because it is something that the historian Richard Felix still talks about to this day, his experience on the Queen Mary. Now, pinch of salt at the ready, this happened during the time when Most Haunted were filming on the ship. Most Haunted not having the best reputation when it comes to paranormal investigation, something that Richard Felix himself has spoken out about on multiple occasions. But he said that while they were there, wet footprints appeared, as if someone had just climbed out of the pool to go back to the dressing rooms. Wet footprints in a room with a completely empty pool. Also a room where unexplained wet footprints are said to manifest. Okay, that in itself, pretty easy to stage. So, something Richard did was that he further investigated the water. As in, he tasted it, just a little... just see what it tasted like. Gotta respect it, braver man than me if it really is foot water, but there we go. And he said, oh, actually, this is salt water. And now, that's really interesting because number one, when the pool was filled and the ocean liner was in operation, they used salt water. But number two, that is going to be a heck of a lot of trouble to set up if it is someone just trying to mess with him and stage something. The water out of the taps obviously isn't salt water, so that means you're going to go outside the ship and carry in water from the Los Angeles River just to set this up, or you're going to dissolve a packet of table salt in the water. Like Richard says when he tells this story, it's not impossible for someone super motivated, but seems like a lot. And so some believe that little Jackie is responsible for these wet footprints, or possibly it's another entity entirely. A woman in 1930s swimwear has been seen walking from the dressing rooms to the pool, and then other people have witnessed shadow figures diving into the empty pool below. Someone who appears to be a little less happy with you being in this area is an entity that's taken on the nickname Grumpy, because if he's around, you'll know it by the fact that he'll growl at you. Charming, just what you want to hear. He seems to stay around this first class pool, although he has been equally as unfriendly in the hallways and even in the boiler room, but we don't know who this entity could be. But the dressing rooms for the pool are a super interesting area too. Firstly, because a ghostly cat has been witnessed around here. Yeah, I know, just sign me straight up. Leave me in the pool room, I'll take Casper the unfriendly ghost as long as I get the cat too. This cat has been seen, heard, and even felt, with witnesses describing feeling the brush of a cat on their legs. Wonder if you start tripping over something unseen when it gets to dinner time. They always manage to be just in front of you and also under your feet at the same time when that little food bowl comes out. Both of mine have fallen out with me because I've flea treated them this morning, so they probably will not make an appearance. But some people have suggested, these people being psychic mediums, that the first class dressing rooms is also the location of a vortex, a collection of electromagnetic energy that acts as a portal between our world and the spirit world. What I can only imagine looks like the afterlife waiting room in Beetlejuice. But some believe that this vortex is the reason that the Queen Mary is as haunted as people claim. And it's said that if you stand in the spot where this vortex is kind of just in the little corridor before you go into all the changing stalls, you'll feel all the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end, and you'll get that horrible, dreadful, skin-crawling kind of sensation. And eventually you'll just have to leave because you'll go all dizzy and overwhelmed with terror. Your fight or flight will kick in and that's it, you're gone. But paranormal investigators have apparently picked up on the presence of another ghostly child in this area called Sarah, who appears as a thin little girl around 8 to 10 years old with dark brown hair. And it's thought that while she has a strong bond with Jackie, she is sometimes seen with her, Sarah actually acts as a bit of a guardian for this vortex, controlling who can pass to either side. But that is the testimony of paranormal investigators and mediums like Peter James, and similarly to Jackie, we don't have any record of a Sarah passing away on the Queen Mary. We haven't even been able to track down who she actually is. But alongside Jackie and Sarah, there is also said to be the ghost of a little boy haunting the Queen Mary, again in the first class pool area, but also other areas of the ship like the decks, or even, if you're unlucky enough, inside the hotel staterooms while you're trying to get some sleep. He's only known as the Blue Boy. We have no name for him, only that he looks to be no more than 3 years old with curly red hair and a navy and white old-fashioned sailor suit. But he's called the Blue Boy because when he appears, he glows a faint blue colour. Just like the other kids, we don't know any more about who he may have been in life, how he came to be haunting the Queen Mary, but he was witnessed once walking hand in hand with an elderly woman before the pair disappeared through a solid wall. But this is a common theme for a lot of the ghosts on the Queen Mary. There are a few famous ones with horrendous backstories, which of course I will be sharing with you in this episode, but for a lot of them we just get fleeting glimpses of them, and knowing who they might have been in life is usually no better than a best guess kind of thing. But I guess that's all just part of the fun of the paranormal, isn't it? Just like this next story of another incredibly famous phantom on board the Queen Mary, the Lady in White. And so what is now known as the Queen's Salon, that used to be the first class lounge, and it's in this room where the Lady in White has been seen, dancing away to music that no one else can hear anymore. Sometimes you'll feel someone brush past you in a dress, like an employee in 2001 who was at work very early in the morning, like 5:30 a.m, and she felt someone brush past her chair, so she looked up to see a pale woman gliding across the room before again disappearing through a solid wall. But then other times, and perhaps even more unsettling, passengers will get into one of the lifts knowing that they're totally alone, but once the doors close behind them and they look up into the mirror, they'll see a woman in a white dress standing behind them, staring at them. Do not love that. Not in a confined space like that, no thank you. Obviously the passengers will have pretty much the same reaction and spin round to look at who this woman is, only there's nothing there. And when they turn back round to look at the reflection again, she's gone from there too. And so being seen in that area of the Queen Mary, could she have been a first class passenger? Being witnessed dancing in there, it does seem that way. Although people say that being dressed in white, could she also possibly have been one of the war brides who were transported to the USA after World War II to be reunited with their husbands? Because I'm sure that would have been a very high energy time, leaving home to go start your new life with your new husband. Perhaps that energy has imprinted on the ship, who knows? But it's not just the first class lounge with the ghostly unknown woman. What used to be the third class lounge has a bit of a story there too, because in 1989, as two employees entered the room now known as the Mauritania room, getting ready to set up for a private event, they both noticed a young woman sitting there, dressed in vintage 1940s style clothing, just completely alone and staring at their mural on the wall. Okay. She didn't even look over at them, and she wasn't doing any harm. It wasn't in the way. So the two employees kind of just shrugged and proceeded to carry on around her. They didn't need to move her at that moment. But a bit later on, their manager came into the room to see how they were getting on, and immediately, obviously, called out the fact that there shouldn't be a member of the public in there, because the woman was still sitting there. So they tried to get her to leave. Tried once, excuse me, sorry, you can't be in here. Nothing. Tried again. Excuse me, madam, we need to set up for a private event. You have to leave. Again, nothing. On the third attempt, as the manager was just about to pick up the phone and call security, all three staff members watched as this woman completely silently just disappeared, dematerialised. The chair she was sitting on included, both just not there anymore. Which is a really interesting moment in time to be replayed, isn't it? Nothing super major, just what seems to be a third class passenger enjoying the decor on board. But unfortunately, not all ghost stories are from a harmless little snapshot in time like that, because the third class staircase is home to the entity known as the Man in Black. Not that one. He appears as a shadowy figure, silently walking either up or down the stairs, or sometimes you'll just hear his footsteps. There were two guests in the early 2000s though who were in the area and claimed to see a tray, like a room service tray, get flung across the corridor, food going everywhere, and then there was just this sudden rush of icy cold air before a sign fell off the wall from nearby. Just a kind of one thing after another series of events that seemed like the Man in Black didn't want your company right now, thank you. But it is possible that we may know who this particular entity is. And his story is so sad, because on the 10th of October 1954, 58-year-old George Sidney Wayman was found at the bottom of the staircase dead. His cause of death was officially listed as coronary thrombosis, as though it was just recorded as, oh, he passed away from natural causes, and that was that. But some think that possibly he may have fallen, and falling on these stairs, you're not going to come out of it unscathed. Because of where this staircase is, in the third class area, it is steep and it is straight up and down. There's no little landing in the middle to break your fall. But one particularly dangerous feature of this staircase was that if you were sailing in particularly rough seas and the Queen Mary was pitching violently over the waves and you just so happened to be on the stairs at the time, the staircase could very much just fall away from under you and you'd end up in a broken heap at the bottom of the stairs. As George's death death was listed as natural causes. I couldn't find any records to say that he had any broken bones or any indication that he did fall, but still, it is a possibility from where he was found. But we are about to get even sadder with the ghost stories, because this next entity, his death was preventable, or at the very least he could have tried to do something about it. Let me explain. In September 1949, Second Officer William E. Stark was invited to the staff captain's cabin for a little pre-dinner drink. He arrived there first, and so while he was waiting, he asked the steward to bring him a bottle of gin. Just get a little drink in beforehand. The steward obliged and handed William the gin bottle from the captain's cupboard. Notice how I say the gin bottle and not the bottle of gin. William poured himself a healthy G&T and took that first sip, and immediately knew that something was wrong. That hadn't tasted right and shouldn't feel like drinking battery acid on the way down. But he just laughed it off and tried to play it cool. The steward wasn't convinced though and kind of looked at him like, "Mate, maybe you should go and get medical attention? I don't think that was gin that you just drank." William refused, even going to dinner and having another gin and tonic there from a different bottle, joking about how he'd poisoned himself earlier, and so this one was to take the taste away. Unfortunately, next morning it became abundantly clear that William Stark had actually poisoned himself, as he was found collapsed and died 2 days later after the Queen Mary had reached Southampton. Turned out that gin bottle had contained carbon tetrachloride, a toxic chemical that was used in dry cleaning. And so it was probably in the cabin in case the staff captain needed a quick spot stain removal on his uniform or something. There was no foul play suspected. It seems to have been an honest mistake. I can only imagine how guilty that steward would have felt though. If only Stark had gone and got medical help though, he could very well have survived. Even his wife asked him when she reached her husband's bedside in Southampton, "Why didn't you go and get your stomach pumped or something?" To which he replied, "Oh, I didn't think of it." And so he hadn't. But nowadays, his ghost has apparently been seen around the Queen Mary, continuing on his rounds. There was one woman who was getting married on the Queen Mary and she got lost. It happens, it's a big ship. She went up to the nearest staff member that she could find, who was very helpful and showed her where to go. Later on during her stay, when she was checking out, she mentioned that she wanted the hotel staff to thank a Mr. Stark because he had been the one to help her. Lovely guy. Yeah, you already know what I'm gonna say, that there wasn't a Mr. Stark working on board the ship. The only one ever had been William, who had passed away in 1949. But there are also ghost stories seemingly related to the Queen Mary's wartime years, when she herself was known as the Grey Ghost. Because back in the early 2000s, one of the housekeepers was doing her morning rounds, changing towels, emptying bins, all that sort of stuff, when she reached the Winston Churchill suite. She knocked on the door and announced herself, but got no answer, so she opened the door to find a large man sitting in the chair, relaxed as anything, smoking a cigar. Whoa, no, you can't be smoking in here, you need to put that out. The man looked over to her as if to say, "Excuse me? Who do you think you are?" And he stood up. He took one last drag on the cigar, looking straight at her, before vanishing into thin air. But as he faded away, the housekeeper could see through him to the portrait that was hanging on the wall behind him, which looked exactly like the man that had just been standing in front of her, because the man had, supposedly, been Winston Churchill himself. Yeah, I know. He did sail on the Queen Mary multiple times, both during the war and after it had ended. And so now, when cigar smoke is smelled in this room, staff members assume it's Churchill popping over for another stay. But the residual echo of what looks to be a Second World War soldier has also been seen elsewhere on the ship. He appears as a young man in a short-sleeved green uniform on B deck, looking just as solid and real as you or me, but never interacting with anyone before he turns and walks through a solid wall. And when you remember that the Queen Mary transported over 800,000 soldiers during the war, including a single crossing with more than 16,000 packed on board, he could literally be any one of them. Tragically, there does also appear to be a ghostly reminder of the Queen Mary's accident with the HMS Curaçao, and replays can be heard at the bow right at the front of the ship. In 1967, after the Queen Mary had reached her final home in Long Beach, a marine engineer called John Smith was brought in to conduct a thorough investigation, let the city know what they were dealing with. Once he got down into the bow and was going through his inspection, he heard something that made his blood run cold that had him convinced he was about to witness a tragic disaster or even be taken out by it himself. Out of nowhere, and with no warning, he heard the deafening sounds of metal twisting, along with water rushing in and men screaming for their lives. He frantically searched the entire area, but there was nothing out of place. No water, no people, and he was just absolutely shaken. He had no explanation for what he had most definitely heard, but it wasn't until much later when he learned about the HMS Kurosawa and figured that it must have been the residual sounds that he had heard. And while over 300 of the Kurosawa's crew died in that collision, no one on board the Queen Mary died that day. But interestingly, shadow figures have been seen in that area in the bow of the ship. There was one instance when a tour guide had reached this area and had positioned all the visitors in front of them so that they could tell the story of the collision and the residual haunting. And this was a really dimly lit area of the ship. They were practically in the dark, just kind of seeing outlines sort of thing, when apparently the entire group noticed what looked like a second staff member appear from behind the corner and stand behind the guide. The tour guide carried on, finished up the story, and was about to move everyone on when they all asked, "Oh, does your colleague need something? Are they joining us?" Sorry, what? There was no one else there. And there wasn't. There never had been a second person there, but that entire group saw it. Just a massive, shadowy figure standing there, towering behind the actual tour guide. In a proper, "it's right behind me, isn't it?" Oh, just no. But something that horrified me as I was researching this one was the story about the victims of the Kurosawa collision also haunting the stern of the ship for an absolutely heartbreaking reason. So a bit of context, when the Queen Mary was sold to the city of Long Beach, one of the conditions of sale was that she could never be seaworthy again. Cunard were to be the only operators of her as an ocean liner. Long Beach agreed and decided to make it work in their favour by removing 3 out of the 4 propellers but keeping 1. And around that remaining propeller, they set up a walkway that extends out of the ship, so it's like his own separate room, but obviously to connect it to the rest of the Queen Mary you had to cut a massive hole. So Long Beach set up this walkway around the propeller. They got a nifty little exhibit out of it. Cunard is happy because you can't set sail with a little extension bolted onto the side, not quite sound enough to handle the open ocean, but this room is now said to be haunted by victims from the Kurosawa, because the story goes that as the Queen Mary carried on steaming ahead after slicing the Navy cruiser in 2, some men who were thrown into the water were killed by the passing propellers, which is just... that's heavy. I couldn't find any witness records or proof that that actually did happen, but that's not to say that it didn't. Only 99 out of a crew of over 400 were rescued from the water, so yeah. And so now people feel extremely uneasy in here. They're overwhelmed with intense feelings of sadness or extreme panic, which some believe to be their energy. I, however, do think that possibly some of these people experiencing those feelings may also be suffering from submechanophobia though, which was something that I had absolutely no idea about until recently, but it's a fear of large man-made things submerged underwater. Makes people feel super creeped out and anxious. And I do get it. The Wikipedia photo to go along with the article is of a diver next to a submarine. I get how people could feel iffy about it. And the Queen Mary's propeller being seen under the water, that does set a lot of people off as well. But there has also been the sound of a man heard talking in this room too, and he seems to be mumbling quite worriedly. Something's clearly bothering him, and some believe it to be the disembodied voice of Captain John Treasure Jones, the last captain of the Queen Mary. He didn't pass away on the ship, but they just believe that maybe he has come back to her after his death in 1993. He has also been witnessed walking around in this area, so people think that maybe he's a bit worried about where the other 3 propellers are or why there's a massive hole in the ship. But when he's not down in the propeller box, he has also been witnessed by visitors elsewhere, even saying hello to people before vanishing in front of their eyes. But I have still got so many more ghost stories to tell you, and this next one is quite an infamous one involving another real life tragedy. I know, as if the story of the Kurosawa was going to be as bad as it got today. Unfortunately not. But in the early hours of the 10th of July 1966, the Queen Mary was sailing through fog, and as part of a routine safety drill, all of the watertight doors in the engine rooms and the boiler rooms had been closed. 18-year-old John Tedder had been working down there as a bilge cleaner. He'd only been with Cunard for a few months and was on his 5th voyage. But once the drill ended, he was discovered trapped in watertight door 13. He was unconscious and didn't have any external injuries other than a small trail of blood from his nose. Immediately, they got to work getting him out. He was given a shot of morphine just on the off chance that he woke up when they released the door, but he didn't, and he passed away in the infirmary from his injuries. But now, to this day, a man wearing blue overalls has been seen around the area of door 13, sometimes whistling to himself, or other times actually coming up to people and asking if they've seen his wrench. And that was interesting because no one knows why John got stuck in the door. How did he manage that? What was he doing? Why was he trying to squeeze through? And so some believe that he had dropped his wrench behind him as the doors were closing and he went to pick it back up, but not wanting to get cut off from the rest of the ship for the entire safety drill, he tried to squeeze through quickly, but didn't make it. But in reality, we just don't know why. But the infirmary itself is also, perhaps unsurprisingly, said to now be haunted too, with visitors claiming to see phantom doctors and nurses tending to patients who aren't there anymore. Others just start up in absolute fits of coughing and gasping for breath. I totally know that feeling after recovering from a cold this week. But as soon as they leave the area, they're totally fine. Here it comes. And then others just comment on how the atmosphere feels really heavy and tense and just sad. But that does seem to be the story wherever you go on the Queen Mary. People have strange, unexplained experiences in pretty much every area of the ship. People see shadow figures and even hear footsteps echoing down corridors that are completely carpeted and shouldn't make a sound. So knowing all of that, there are a lot of visitors and hotel guests who leave practically disappointed when they don't encounter one of the supposedly hundreds of ghosts. Because the Queen Mary does lean into that reputation, in large part due to the stories that only really surfaced during the time of Disney, like we said. But even nowadays, there's ghost tours where guides are told to neither confirm nor deny stories, just tell them as they were reported and where they supposedly happened. Hiring out for paranormal investigations, TV shows like Ghost Adventures, Most Haunted, Ghost Hunters, even Gail Porter and Chris Fleming looking for the ghost of Lucille Ball in their show Dead Famous. And then you've got the whole scare attraction thing, Dark Harbour. One of the scare mazes tells the story of a little girl said to lure people towards the vortex in the first class swimming pool. And I've said it before on this channel, fair enough, using the paranormal as an income stream. It keeps these places of historical significance going and funded enough to survive. But I need to talk about the elephant in the room, the haunted elephant in the stateroom, I suppose you could say. Because I haven't yet mentioned Stateroom B340, said to be the most haunted room in the entire ship. It's certainly the most infamous. So back when she was sailing across the Atlantic on the regular, B340 didn't exist. Originally, it was 3 third-class staterooms, B222, 224 and 226. The backstory as to why this area became haunted is absolutely wild, but there's also about 10 different versions of it, with the most famous one being that back in the 1960s, a passenger went completely off the rails and murdered 2 women while the Queen Mary was out at sea. This passenger, he was caught and locked up in one of these 3 rooms, waiting for them to reach New York City so he could be arrested. A guard was stationed outside of his room so he couldn't escape, but all through the night he was banging on the door and screaming to be let out, saying that something was in this room with him and it was going to kill him. Yeah, alright mate, sure thing bud. But when they opened the door the next morning, the sight that greeted the guard was like something out of a horror movie, because this guy looked like he had been pulled apart. Limbs, entrails everywhere, which is not the sort of thing that you can do alone. That's the story, anyway. However, there's no record of any of this happening. Not a single newspaper mention, no missing people, no arrests, nothing. There is also a slightly less dramatic version, which claims that a British author called Walter J. Adamson died of natural causes in one of these 3 rooms back in 1948. But again, this guy only seems to exist in connection with the Queen Mary. He's not listed as one of the passengers who died. I couldn't even find any books he'd published if he was an author or anything like that. So yeah, the backstory for room B340 seems unlikely. So what could have happened? Well, apparently a lot of people believe that it all comes back to good old Disney again. Before they'd got involved, those 3 staterooms got turned into the one single hotel room, B340, as part of the 1970s refit. But then in the late 80s, early 90s, when Disney was running the show, that room happened to be closed for renovations. And supposedly, employees had made up this sensational ghostly backstory to explain why that room was closed to the public. Instead of it just being shut for a spruce up, it had been closed off because guests kept leaving in the middle of the night, terrified by what they had experienced in there. And then it just snowballed from there. It was then locked up to keep guests safe from whatever's haunting that room. But that sort of story, it's like saying you can't go into this animal shelter because the animals are too cute. You won't be able to handle it. All you're going to be able to think about, or at least all I'm going to be able to think about, is getting into that animal shelter to adopt the cutest animals of your entire life. So people were desperate to get a look inside this room, and the room developed a monster reputation. Everyone wanted to stay in the haunted room B340. In 2018, on Friday the 13th of April, no less, they actually finally reopened this room to paying guests, and they went full send on the paranormal reputation. They fitted out the room with a Ouija board, tarot cards, there's instructions for summoning Bloody Mary in the bathroom mirror. It's a whole thing. Unsurprisingly, almost immediately, the reports started flooding in. Guests would ring down to reception, asking them, look, I know that this is the haunted room that we paid specifically to be here, but can you turn off the special effects? Because we're trying to get some sleep. But yeah, while the room has been made up to put you in that haunted frame of mind, the staff claim that there are no special effects in that room. But guests would complain of having the covers yanked off them in the middle of the night. The taps in the bathroom would turn themselves on at random times. Sometimes they'd hear disembodied laughter, screaming, or voices having a conversation. And there was one story of a woman who was staying in this room who was woken up when her covers were pulled off the bed, and as she looked to see what was going on, she saw a shadow figure standing over her. Really don't like that. But aside from that, a lot mention that the vibe in that room is apparently completely rancid. People talk about nausea, vertigo, or just like the air's moving wrong, giving them this overwhelming urge to nope out of the room entirely. So while some are adamant that the reason behind why B340 is haunted has been fabricated, guests staying in there are convinced that what they experienced in this room is real, that there is something going on here. Whether it's just because they've heard the stories and they're almost conditioned that way, or whether there truly is some sort of energy for whatever reason, something going on. That's up to you to decide. But room B340 isn't the only one with a murky backstory. This one isn't as famous, but again on B-Deck, there's said to be two girls who haunt the area, especially around room B474. The legend claims that in 1959, a father was travelling third class with his wife and two daughters when he suddenly turned violent, and he's said to have killed all three of them before taking his own life. Now, the ghost of the two girls have been witnessed together on the ship calling out for their mother, which is heartbreaking. So, these murders actually did happen. Only it wasn't 1959, it was 1964, and it wasn't on board the Queen Mary, it was in Roanoke, Virginia. A 25-year-old salesman called Fraser Tingler murdered his wife Jill and their two daughters, 6-year-old Dana and 4-year-old Penny, before ending his own life. There was a connection to the Queen Mary though, in that Jill's mother, Mary Johnston, had just finished up a 6-week visit with the family and was on board the Queen Mary on her way home when the murders happened. News obviously reached the ship, but the decision was made not to tell Mary what had happened to her daughter and granddaughters until she got home. So regardless of those stories where they have no historical record or they seem to have gotten a bit mixed up over the years, those two areas, and really the entire B-Deck, it seems to be a very active area of the ship for unexplained encounters. People commonly see figures walking through walls in the corridors, or will get very pale and dizzy for seemingly no reason. But maybe that's the whole thing. It seems like the Queen Mary doesn't need sensationalised backstories, because it's not about one single ghost or legend. Because some people say that the Queen Mary feels almost alive in her own way. Captain John Treasure Jones, the ship's last captain, he once said that he felt like she had a personality, almost her own character, and that she was the closest thing to a living creature that he'd ever commanded. You only had to will her to do something, and it was like she already knew what you wanted her to do. But do you think the Queen Mary is haunted? Are some stories you're utterly convinced of but others don't seem to sit quite right? Or is all of it completely made up to draw in the masses who want to pay for a chance to see a ghost? I do feel like the Queen Mary is haunted. I think she saw a lot in her time on the ocean. There were accidents, there were deaths, even tragic disasters that she was involved in. I think that's all going to leave a mark on the ship. But just talking about these tragedies, and really all of the deaths that occurred on this ship, the people deserve to be honoured and remembered. It's easy when we're talking about ghost stories to forget that behind them there were real people and real families and loved ones who were left behind who were never the same again. Even so far as the men who sailed on her during World War II, many of them being sent out never made it back home. And so there's a lot of energy there. Not to mention the energy of passengers having the time of their lives on holiday or starting new lives overseas. Or maybe this voyage is to secure a business deal that will change the trajectory of your life forever. Those big moments, that excitement, nervousness and anticipation. I do think all of that will have left a mark, and so I can absolutely imagine that there is some sort of energy still remaining there. But that said, I do feel like the Queen Mary is a victim of her own legends sometimes. Her history, as we saw last episode, is absolutely fascinating, but it almost gets overshadowed sometimes by the ghosts. And the paranormal is such a popular income stream for the ship, a big reason why a lot of people go to visit and to stay, which helps to fund maintenance and repairs. I mean, I was looking at the cost of renting room B340. It's upwards of $700 a night. During October, the highest price I saw was $1,200. For one night. I was trying to be nosy and see what Halloween was, but already that's booked for next year, of course. So there does have to be some level of skepticism. It is in the ship's financial interests to draw in people who are interested in the paranormal. Ghost stories bring more people in, expecting to see a ghost, who then have their own experiences that they share, and so the cycle continues. But it would be very cool to see how things have changed through her refurbishments over the years, to see if we could match up where so many of these residual figures walking through the walls have been seen, to see if there used to be a doorway there or something. But yeah, bottom line for me, I definitely think there is something going on here. Even if it is just some energy, it does seem like a lot of residual stuff. But let me know your thoughts. Haunted, completely made up for the money, somewhere in between? Have you had your own experience on board the Queen Mary that has you convinced that there is something going on? Let me know all of the things. And if you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. And if you haven't already, but you like what I'm up to over here, maybe you'd like to subscribe too. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go and get a drink of water, stay hydrated. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. I had no animals throughout that entire thing. I think Ernie actually did have a bath during that. So he's going to be utterly thrilled. He hates baths. Loves attention, hates baths. But he gets all the attention during a bath. Make it make sense.